Okay, week 9, Thursday. So, only things to worry about for today are taking the vocabulary quiz, and that code should be in your email. And we will finish reading the book. So, we'll start on page 70, where we left off, right after Montag was trembling, and, read to the end. And that's it. All right, so let's find out what ends up happening to Montag. Granger touched Montag's arm. "Welcome back from the dead." Montag nodded. Granger went on. "You might as well know all of us now. This is Fred Clement, former occupant of the Thomas Hardy chair at Cambridge in the years before it became an atomic engineering school. This other is Dr. Simmons from UCLA, a specialist in Ortega y Gasset. Professor West here did quite a bit for ethics, an ancient study now, for Columbia University quite some years ago. Reverend Pat over here gave a few lectures 30 years ago and lost his flock between one Sunday and the next for his views. He's been bumming with us for some time now. Myself, I wrote a book called The Fingers in the Glove, the proper relationship between the individual and society, and here I am. Welcome, Montag." "I don't belong with you," said Montag at last slowly. "I've been an idiot all the way." "We're used to that. We all made the right kind of mistakes or we wouldn't be here. When we were separate individuals, all we had was rage. I struck a fireman when he came to burn my library years ago. I've been running ever since. You want to join us, Montag?" "Yes." "What have you to offer?" "Nothing. I thought I had part of the Book of Ecclesiastes and maybe a little of Revelation, but I haven't even that now." "The Book of Ecclesiastes would be fine. Where was it?" "Here." Montag touched his head. "Ah." Granger smiled and nodded. "What's wrong? Isn't that all right?" said Montag. "Better than all right. Perfect." Granger turned to the Reverend. "Do we have a Book of Ecclesiastes?" "One. A man named Harris of Youngstown." "Montag." Granger took Montag's shoulder firmly. "Walk carefully. Guard your health. If anything should happen to Harris, you are the Book of Ecclesiastes. See how important you've become in the last minute." "But I've forgotten." "No, nothing's ever lost. We have ways to shake down your clinkers for you." "But I've tried to remember." "Don't try. It'll come when we need it. All of us have photographic memories, but spend a lifetime learning how to block off the things that are really in there. Simmons here has worked on it for 20 years, and now we've got the method down to where we can recall anything that's been read once. Would you like someday, Montag, to read Plato's Republic?" "Of course." "I am Plato's Republic. Like to read Marcus Aurelius? Mr. Simmons is Marcus." "How do you do?" said Mr. Simmons. "Hello," said Montag. "I want you to meet Jonathan Swift, the author of that evil political book, Gulliver's Travels. And this other fellow is Charles Darwin. And this one is Schopenhauer. And this one is Einstein. And this one here at my elbow is Mr. Albert Schweitzer, a very kind philosopher indeed. Here we all are, Montag. Aristophanes and Mahatma Gandhi and Gautama Buddha and Confucius and Thomas Love Peacock and Thomas Jefferson and Mr. Lincoln, if you please. We are also Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John." Everyone laughed quietly. "It can't be," said Montag. "It is," replied Granger, smiling. "We're book burners, too. We read the books and burnt them, afraid they'd be found. Microfilming didn't pay off. We were always traveling. We didn't want to bury the film and come back later. Always the chance of discovery. Better to keep it in the old heads, where no one can see it or suspect it. We are all bits and pieces of history and literature and international law. Byron, Tom Paine, Machiavelli, or Christ. It's here. And the hour is late, and the war has begun. And we are out here, and the city is there, all wrapped up in its own coat of 1,000 colors. What do you think, Montag?" "I think I was blind trying to do things my way, planting books in firemen's houses and sending in alarms." "You did what you had to do. Carried out on a national scale, it might have worked beautifully. But our way is simpler, and we think better. All we want to do is keep the knowledge we think we will need intact and safe. We're not out to incite or anger anyone, yet. For if we are destroyed, the knowledge is dead, perhaps for good. We are model citizens in our own special way. We walk the old tracks, we lie in the hills at night, and the city people let us be. We're stopped and searched occasionally, but there's nothing on our persons to incriminate us. The organization is flexible, very loose and fragmentary. Some of us have had plastic surgery on our faces and fingerprints. Right now, we have a horrible job. We're waiting for the war to begin, and as quickly end. It's not pleasant, but then we're not in control. We're the odd minority crying in the wilderness. When the war is over, perhaps we can be of some use in the world." "Do you really think they'll listen, then?" "If not, we'll just have to wait. We'll pass the books on to our children by word of mouth and let our children wait, in turn, on the other people. A lot will be lost that way, of course. But you can't make people listen. They have to come round in their own time, wondering what happened and why the world blew up under them. It can't last. How many of you are there? Thousands on the road, the abandoned rail tracks, tonight, bums on the outside, libraries inside. It wasn't planned at first. Each man had a book he wanted to remember and did. Then, over a period of 20 years or so, we met each other, traveling. Got the loose network together and set out a plan. The most important single thing we had to pound into ourselves was that we were not important. We mustn't be pedants. We were not to feel superior to anyone else in the world. We're nothing more than dust jackets for books, of no significance otherwise. Some of us live in small towns. Chapter 1 of Thoreau's Walden in Green River. Chapter 2 in Willow Farm, Maine. Why, there's one town in Maryland, only 27 people. No bomb will ever touch that town. It's the complete essays of a man named Bertrand Russell. Pick up that town, almost, and flip the pages, so many pages to a person. And when the war's over, someday, some year, the books can be written again. The people will be called in one by one to recite what they know, and we'll set it up in type until another dark age, when we might have to do the whole damn thing over again. But that's the wonderful thing about man. He never gets so discouraged or disgusted that he gives up doing it all over again, because he knows very well it is important and worth the doing. "What do we do tonight?" asked Montag. "Wait," said Granger, and moved downstream a little way, just in case. He began throwing dust and dirt on the fire. The other men helped, and Montag helped. And there, in the wilderness, the men all moved their hands, putting out the fire together. They stood by the river in the starlight. Montag saw the luminous dial of his waterproof watch. 5 o'clock in the morning. Another year ticked by in a single hour, and dawn waiting beyond the far bank of the river. "Why do you trust me?" said Montag. A man moved in the darkness. "The look of you's enough. You haven't seen yourself in a mirror lately. Beyond that, the city never cared so much about us to bother with an elaborate chase like this to find us. A few crackpots with verses in their head can't touch them, and they know it, and we know it. Everyone knows it. So long as the vast population doesn't wander about quoting the Magna Carta and the Constitution, it's all right. The firemen were enough to check that now and then. No, the cities don't bother us, and you look like hell." They moved along the bank of the river going south. Montag tried to see the men's faces, the old faces he remembered from the firelight, lined and tired. He was looking for a brightness, a resolve, a triumph over tomorrow that hardly seemed to be there. Perhaps he had expected their faces to burn and glitter with the knowledge they carried, to glow as lanterns glow, with the light in them. But all the light had come from the campfire, and these men had seemed no different from any others who had run a long race, searched a long search, seen good things destroyed, and now, very late, were gathering to wait for the end of the party and the blowing out of the lamps. They weren't at all certain that the things they carried in their heads might make every future dawn glow with a purer light. They were sure of nothing, save that the books were on file behind their quiet eyes. The books were waiting, with their pages uncut, for the customers who might come by in later years, some with clean and some with dirty fingers. Montag squinted from one face to another as they walked. "Don't judge a book by its cover," someone said, and they all laughed quietly, moving downstream. All right, so let's pause there as the men move away from their campfire. So we already talked about how these men are different from typical homeless people. Now, obviously, we have a notable addition to that. These men, somehow, through some advanced technological or neurological technique, have the ability to read and memorize books. So the list of books that are contained within these 5 individuals is pretty impressive, and we assume they've been doing this for many, many years. Now, Montag thinks that he took in enough of the book of Ecclesiastes to be able to maybe have it somewhere in his mind. Granger is confident that they can get the book of Ecclesiastes out of his head. So whatever technique they used, whatever magic memorization technique is not ever revealed. But we assume that this is part of our magical future. So Montag is not dead, as the city thinks. He is alive, and he has friends. And his friends think that they can help him, and he can help them. And maybe once the war, blows up the world and shuts off the technology, maybe they can make a difference. So it's a long game, but it is a plan of some sorts. Okay, well, don't think there's anything other than that in that section. So let's carry on, see what's next for Montag and his new literary friends. There was a shriek, and the jets from the city were gone overhead long before the men looked up. Montag stared back at the city, far down the river, only a faint glow now. My wife's back there. I'm sorry to hear that. The cities won't do well in the next few days, said Granger. It's strange. I don't miss her. It's strange. I don't feel much of anything, said Montag. Even if she dies, I realized a moment ago, I don't think I'll feel sad. It isn't right. Something must be wrong with me. Listen, said Granger, taking his arm and walking with him, holding aside the bushes to let him pass. When I was a boy, my grandfather died. He was a sculptor. He was also a very kind man who had a lot of love to give the world, and he helped clean up the slum in our town, and he made toys for us, and he did a million things in his lifetime. He was always busy with his hands. And when he died, I suddenly realized I wasn't crying for him at all, but for the things he did. I cried because he would never do them again. He would never carve another piece of wood, or help us raise doves and pigeons in the backyard, or play the violin the way he did, or tell us jokes the way he did. He was part of us, and when he died, all the actions stopped dead, and there was no one to do them just the way he did. He was individual. He was an important man. I've never gotten over his death. Often I think what wonderful carvings never came to birth because he died. How many jokes are missing from the world, and how many homing pigeons untouched by his hands. He shaped the world. He did things to the world. The world was bankrupted of 10 million fine actions the night he passed on. Montag walked in silence. Millie, Millie, he whispered. Millie. What? My wife. Poor Millie, poor Millie. I can't remember anything. I think of her hands, but I don't see them doing anything at all. They just hang there at her sides, or they lie there on her lap, or there's a cigarette in them. But that's all. Montag turned and glanced back. What did you give to the city, Montag? Ashes. What did the others give to each other? Nothingness. Granger stood looking back with Montag. Everyone must leave something behind when he dies, my grandfather said. A child, or a book, or a painting, or a house, or a wall built, or a pair of shoes made, or a garden planted. Something your hand touched some way so your soul has somewhere to go when you die. And when people look at that tree or that flower you planted, you're there. It doesn't matter what you do, he said, so long as you change something from the way it was before you touched it into something that's like you after you take your hands away. The difference between the man who just cuts lawns and a real gardener is in the touching, he said. The lawn cutter might just as well not have been there at all. The gardener will be there a lifetime. Granger moved his hand. My grandfather showed me some V2 rocket films once, 50 years ago. Have you ever seen the atom bomb mushroom from 200 miles up? It's a pinprick. It's nothing, with the wilderness all around it. My grandfather ran off the V2 rocket films a dozen times, and then hoped that someday our cities would open up and let the green and the land and the wilderness in more, to remind people that we're allotted a little space on Earth, and that we survive in that wilderness that can take back what it has given, as easily as blowing its breath on us, or sending the sea to tell us we are not so big. When we forget how close the wilderness is in the night, my grandpa said, someday it will come and get us, for we will have forgotten how terrible and real it can be. You see? Granger turned to Montag. Grandfather's been dead for all these years, but if you lifted my skull, by God, in the convolutions of my brain, you'd find the big ridges of his thumbprint. He touched me. As I said earlier, he was a sculptor. I hate a Roman named Status Quo, he said to me. Stuff your eyes with wonder, he said. Live as if you'd drop dead in 10 seconds. See the world. It's more fantastic than any dream made or paid for in factories. Ask no guarantees. Ask for no security. There never was such an animal. And if there were, it would be related to the great sloth, which hangs upside down in a tree all day, every day, sleeping its life away. To hell with that, he said. Shake the tree, and knock the great sloth down on his ass. Look! Cried Montag. And the war began and ended in that instant. Later, the men around Montag could not say if they had really seen anything. Perhaps the merest flourish of light and motion in the sky. Perhaps the bombs were there, and the jets, 10 miles, 5 miles, 1 mile up, for the merest instant, like grain thrown over the heavens by a great sowing hand, and the bombs drifting with dreadful swiftness, yet sudden slowness, down upon the morning city they had left behind. The bombardment was, to all intents and purposes, finished, once the jets had sighted their target, alerted their bombardiers at 5,000 miles an hour. As quick as the whisper of a scythe, the war was finished. Once the bomb release was yanked, it was over. Now, a full 3 seconds, all of the time in history, before the bomb struck. The enemy ships themselves were gone half around the visible world, like bullets in which a savage islander might not believe because they were invisible. Yet the heart is suddenly shattered, the body falls in separate motions, and the blood is astonished to be freed on the air. The brain squanders its few precious memories and, puzzled, dies. This was not to be believed. It was merely a gesture. Montag saw the flirt of a great metal fist over the far city, and he knew the scream of the jets that would follow would say, after the deed, disintegrate, leave no stone on another, perish, die. Montag held the bombs in the sky for a single moment, with his mind and his hands reaching helplessly up at them. Run! He cried to Faber, to Clarice. Run! To Mildred. Get out of there! But Clarice, he remembered, was dead. And Faber was out. There in the deep valleys of the country somewhere, the 5 a.m. bus was on its way from one desolation to another. Though the desolation had not yet arrived, was still in the air. It was certain as man could make it. Before the bus had run another 50 yards on the highway, its destination would be meaningless, and its point of departure changed from metropolis to junkyard. And Mildred, get out, run! He saw her in her hotel room, somewhere now, in the half-second remaining with the bombs a yard, a foot, an inch from her building. He saw her leaning toward the great shimmering walls of color and motion where the family talked and talked and talked to her, where the family prattled and chatted and said her name and smiled at her and said nothing of the bomb that was an inch, now a half inch, now a quarter inch from the top of the hotel. Leaning into the wall as if all of the hunger of looking would find the secret of her sleepless unease there. Mildred, leaning anxiously, nervously, as if to plunge, drop, fall into that swarming immensity of color to drown in its bright happiness. The first bomb struck. Mildred! Perhaps, who would ever know? Perhaps the great broadcasting stations, with their beams of color and light and talk and chatter, went first into oblivion. Montag, falling flat, going down, saw or felt or imagined he saw or felt the walls go dark in Millie's face, heard her screaming, because in the millionth part of time left, she saw her own face reflected there, in a mirror instead of a crystal ball, and it was such a wildly empty face all by itself in the room, touching nothing, starved and eating of itself, that at last she recognized it as her own, and looked quickly up at the ceiling as it and the entire structure of the hotel blasted down upon her, carrying her with 1,000,000 pounds of brick, metal, plaster, and wood, to meet other people in the hives below, all on their quick way down to the cellar where the explosion rid itself of them in its own unreasonable way. I remember. Montag clung to the earth. I remember. Chicago a long time ago. Millie and I, that's where we met. I remember now. Chicago, a long time ago. The concussion knocked the air across and down the river, turned the men over like dominoes in a line, blew the water in lifting sprays, and blew the dust, and made the trees above them mourn with a great wind passing away south. Montag crushed himself down, squeezing himself small, eyes tight. He blinked once, and in that instant saw the city, instead of the bombs, in the air. They had displaced each other. For another of those impossible instants, the city stood, rebuilt and unrecognizable. Taller than it had ever hoped or strived to be, taller than man had built it, erected at last in gouts of shattered concrete and sparkles of torn metal into a mural hung like a reversed avalanche, 1,000,000 colors, 1,000,000 oddities, a door where a window should be, a top for a bottom, a side for a back. And then the city rolled over and fell down dead. Montag, lying there, eyes gritted shut with dust, a fine wet cement of dust in his now shut mouth, gasping and crying, now thought again, I remember something else. What is it? Yes, part of Ecclesiastes and Revelation. Part of that book, part of it. Quick now, quick, before it gets away, before the shock wears off, before the wind dies. Book of Ecclesiastes. Here. He said it over to himself, silently, lying flat to the trembling earth. He said the words of it many times, and they were perfect without trying, and there was no Denham's dentifrice anywheres. It was just the preacher, by himself, standing there in his mind, looking at him. All right, let's pause there for a second. So you may have been thinking, well, things have kind of started winding down. Montag's probably just going to wander with these dudes for the rest of time. Things are just going to end sort of peacefully here. Not quite. So he and Granger are having this interesting conversation about, why we mourn people when they are dead. Perhaps it is not just because of who they are, but because of the things that they do, the things that they did in our lives, and that's why they matter. And of course, as they are ruminating about death, well, a little something happens that causes a whole lot of death. Now, one thing to keep in mind historically is that this book was written in the 1950s. During the 1950s, what war was going on? Kind of a trick question. Not technically an active war, but the most passive war of all time, the Cold War. So during the 1950s, the United States and Russia both built up their nuclear arsenals to a ridiculous degree, and there was a serious fear throughout the world of, one of these countries launching their bombs at the other country and, just causing a nuclear winter, just blowing up the world with all of this madness. Now, at this time period, they didn't know as much about the long-term effects of these bombs. So, for example, when the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki went off, they caused some pretty horrific long-term illness in people who, weren't even in the blast radius. They were outside of the city areas, but, like cancers and stuff like that. Now, since they didn't know that, we're just going to assume that these are future magical bombs and that Montag is going to be okay and he doesn't, secretly have like illness now because of the explosions. So I assume that was the premise upon which Ray Bradbury wrote this book at the time. But even though Montag is presumably going to be okay, everybody else, not so much. So the moment that the bombs drop, it starts here when Montag says, look, and it is extended throughout the next page. These like 3 seconds before the bomb drops on the city. It kind of reminds me of, if you've seen the movie Inception, the van is like falling backwards, and it seems like the van is falling backwards like so slowly, and it's just like barely even moving, and it just slows down time. That's what I feel like with this. The moment where Montag notices the bombs, and then he has all of these thoughts. I mean, just tons and tons of thoughts just rushing through his head, thinking about the people that he cares about on some level or another. Of course, Clarice, well, she's not going to get blown up by the bomb because she's already dead. Faber, through a miraculous coincidence, I guess Ray Bradbury couldn't bear to kill him off, Faber is safe. Faber is on a bus. The bus is out of the city. So, unless there was a bomb dropped on Faber's bus, then presumably he actually might be okay. So, yay for Faber. And then Mildred. This is the end of Mildred. So sorry, Mildred. Didn't like you much anyways, but, still a bad way to go, I suppose. And Montag has this vision. Obviously, he cannot actually see her in her hotel room, but he imagines what she's doing. Of course, she would be watching the television. She'd be watching her family. She'd be leaning in, looking at these relatives of hers. And then Montag imagines, what if the television stations got taken out first? So what if Mildred, leaning into her screen, suddenly had her screen cut off, go black? So instead of looking into the faces of her little family, she sees herself. And that mirror, here we have the image of the mirror again, that mirror shows her emptiness and her emotional deprivation. And in that moment, maybe she screamed to realize how empty she had really become. Who knows? Of course, this is all in Montag's head. Probably she didn't have time to react to such a thing. But In Montag's mind, he wondered if in that last moment of her life she realized what a waste her life had been. But the blast also did a few good things for Montag. He now remembers where he met Mildred. Yay! So that had been plaguing him, that he couldn't remember that particular detail. Now that she's gone, it has come to him. And then he also remembered part of Ecclesiastes and Revelation. So I assume this is probably not the technique that the gentlemen have, setting off a bomb nearby to jog your memory. But hey, whatever works. And then I really like this last image of the city. And I'm sure you've seen, when a bomb explodes, that kind of like mushroom cloud that occurs. And Montag, in this, half second of time, is able to see the city up in the air. Everything, having been exploded on the ground, it's all been thrown up into the sky for just a moment. So a very, very long description for 3 whole seconds. Okay, so now let's see how things wind up now that, America just got massively bombed, we assume. There, said a voice. The men lay gasping, like fish laid out on the grass. They held to the earth as children hold to familiar things, no matter how cold or dead, no matter what has happened or will happen. Their fingers were clawed into the dirt, and they were all shouting to keep their eardrums from bursting, to keep their sanity from bursting, mouths open, Montag shouting with them, a protest against the wind that ripped their faces and tore at their lips, making their noses bleed. Montag watched the great dust settle, and the great silence move down upon their world. And lying there, it seemed that he saw every single grain of dust and every blade of grass, and that he heard every cry and shout and whisper going up in the world now. Silence fell down in the sifting dust, and all the leisure they might need to look around, to gather the reality of this day into their senses. Montag looked at the river. We'll go on the river. He looked at the old railroad tracks. Or we'll go that way. Or we'll walk on the highways now. And we'll have time to put things into ourselves. And someday, after it sets in us a long time, it'll come out of our hands and our mouths. And a lot of it will be wrong, but just enough of it will be right. We'll just start walking today and see the world and the way the world walks around and talks, the way it really looks. I want to see everything now. And while none of it will be me when it goes in, after a while, it'll all gather together inside, and it'll be me. Look at the world out there. My God, look at it out there. Outside me, out there beyond my face, and the only way to really touch it is to put it where it's finally me, where it's in the blood, where it pumps around 1,000 times 10,000 a day. I get hold of it so it'll never run off. I'll hold on to the world tight someday. I've got one finger on it now. That's a beginning. The wind died. The other men lay a while on the dawn edges of sleep, not yet ready to rise up and begin the day's obligations, its fires and foods, its 1,000 details of putting foot after foot and hand after hand. They lay, blinking their dusty eyelids. You could hear them breathing fast, then slower, then slow. Montag sat up. He did not move any farther, however. The other men did likewise. The sun was touching the black horizon with a faint red tip. The air was cold and smelled of a coming rain. Silently, Granger arose, felt his arms and legs, swearing incessantly under his breath, tears dripping from his face. He shuffled down to the river to look upstream. It's flat, he said a long time later. City looks like a heap of baking powder. It's gone. And a long time after that, I wonder how many knew it was coming. I wonder how many were surprised. And across the world, thought Montag, how many other cities dead? And here in our country, how many? 100? 1,000? Someone struck a match and touched it to a piece of dry paper taken from their pocket, and shoved this under a bit of grass and leaves, and after a while added tiny twigs, which were wet and sputtered but finally caught. And the fire grew larger in the early morning as the sun came up, and the men slowly turned from looking upriver and were drawn to the fire, awkwardly, with nothing to say, and the sun colored the backs of their necks as they bent down. Granger unfolded an oilskin with some bacon in it. We'll have a bite. Then we'll turn around and walk upstream. They'll be needing us up that way. Someone produced a small frying pan, and the bacon went into it, and the frying pan was set on the fire. After a moment, the bacon began to flutter and dance in the pan, and the sputter of it filled the morning air with its aroma. The men watched this ritual silently. Granger looked into the fire. Phoenix. What? There was a silly damn bird called a phoenix back before Christ. Every few hundred years he built a pyre and burned himself up. He must have been first cousin to man. But every time he burnt himself up, he sprang out of the ashes. He got himself born all over again. And it looks like we're doing the same thing over and over. But we've got one damn thing the Phoenix never had. We know the damn silly thing we just did. We know all the damn silly things we've done for 1,000 years. And as long as we know that and always have it around where we can see it, someday we'll stop making the damn funeral pyres and jumping into the middle of them. We pick up a few more people that remember every generation. He took the pan off the fire and let the bacon cool, and they ate it slowly, thoughtfully. Now, let's get on upstream, said Granger, and hold on to one thought. You're not important. You're not anything. Someday the load we're carrying with us may help someone. But even when we had the books on hand, a long time ago, we didn't use what we got out of them. We went right on insulting the dead. We went right on spitting in the graves of all the poor ones who died before us. We're going to meet a lot of lonely people in the next week, in the next month, and the next year. And when they ask us what we're doing, you can say, we're remembering. That's where we'll win out in the long run. And someday we'll remember so much that we'll build the biggest damn steam shovel in history and dig the biggest grave of all time and shove war in and cover it up. Come on now. We're going to go build a mirror factory first and put out nothing but mirrors for the next year and take a long look in them. They finished eating and put out the fire. The day was brightening all about them, as if a pink lamp had been given more wick. In the trees, the birds that had flown away now came back and settled down. Montag began walking, and after a moment found that the others had fallen in behind him, going north. He was surprised and moved aside to let Granger pass, but Granger looked at him and nodded him on. Montag went ahead. He looked at the river and the sky and the rusting track going back down to where the farms lay, where the barns stood full of hay, where a lot of people had walked by in the night on their way from the city. Later, in a month or 6 months, and certainly not more than a year, he would walk along here again, alone, and keep right on going until he caught up with the people. But now there was a long morning's walk until noon, and if the men were silent, it was because there was everything to think about and much to remember. Perhaps later in the morning, when the sun was up and had warmed them, they would begin to talk, or just say the things they remembered, to be sure they were there, to be absolutely certain that things were safe in them. Montag felt the slow stir of words, the slow simmer, and when it came to his turn, what could he say? What could he offer on a day like this to make the trip a little easier? To everything there is a season, yes. A time to break down and a time to build up, yes. A time to keep silence and a time to speak, yes. All that. But what else? What else? Something. And on either side of the river was there a tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Yes, thought Montag, that's the one I'll save for noon. For noon, when we reach the city. Alrighty, so we end on a slightly more positive note after the city gets, exploded. But yeah, there's definitely some sadness here. We see, Granger crying, looking at the flattened city off in the distance. And we have some interesting kind of philosophical thoughts here near the end. We've already talked about the phoenix near the beginning of the book because it was one of Montag's professional symbols associated with the firemen. So the life cycle of the phoenix requires that every once in a while it burns up and is born again. And Granger said this reminds him a lot of mankind because the human race, in many ways, is a cycle of self-destruction and rebirth, that we as a society tend to push ourselves backwards sometimes before we're able to kind of give ourselves a rebirth as a society and move forward and move on. So in some ways, whether it's through the violent destruction of bombs or our culture or however you want to see it, in some ways, maybe we are a little bit like a phoenix. And someday, if we can learn from our history, maybe we'll stop the cycle. We will break the cycle. That's the hope. Let's see. And then there was something else. Oh, yes. So this bit at the end here, all of these quotes are from the book of Ecclesiastes. So it has come into Montag's brain, and it apparently has stayed there, and he wants to share some of the wisdom of the book of Ecclesiastes, of the Bible, with the men that he is traveling with, and with the people that they encounter, the people who may be lost and confused and scared in the wake of this bomb that has terrorized their city. So that is their mission now. Help the people. All right. So I can finally close this out. And yeah, that's all for this week. So major priorities for this nice long weekend would be to finish up these Part 3 questions. You should be able to answer all of them by now. And when we come back next week, we'll have one sort of transitional day, and then we'll get to the test Wednesday and Thursday. And that is all.